Picture this: a royal messenger, weary from weeks of travel, arrives at the palace gates clutching a clay tablet inscribed with urgent words. Across vast deserts and rugged mountains, this fragile piece of earth carried the hopes of kings, the promises of allies, and sometimes the seeds of betrayal. Welcome to the high-stakes world of Bronze Age diplomacy, where trust was as precious as gold, and a single lie could unravel centuries of peace. This was an era when empires like Egypt, the Hittites, and Mycenaean Greece didn't just trade goods, they traded words, sealed in clay, that held the power to start wars or forge unbreakable bonds. But beneath the glittering exchanges of gifts and flattery, something darker lurked: suspicion, deception, and the slow erosion of trust that would eventually bring these mighty civilizations to their knees. What happens when diplomacy fails? The answer lies in the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, one of history's most dramatic turning points. Imagine entire cities abandoned, trade routes falling silent, and kingdoms vanishing almost overnight, all because the delicate web of alliances, built on letters and oaths, finally snapped. The Amarna Letters, a treasure trove of ancient correspondence, reveal the cracks in the system: kings accusing each other of sending fake gold, allies failing to send troops in times of crisis, and once loyal vassals playing both sides. These weren't just petty disputes, they were the warning signs of a world on the brink. And as tensions grew, so did the lies, until the very foundations of international trust crumbled. But why does this matter to us today? Because the story of Bronze Age diplomacy isn't just about ancient kings and forgotten empires. It's a mirror reflecting the fragile nature of human relationships, especially when power and survival are at stake. The same forces that shaped alliances 3,000 years ago still influence global politics today: the fear of betrayal, the struggle to maintain balance, and the devastating consequences when communication breaks down. As we piece together the clues from clay tablets and ruined palaces, we'll uncover how these ancient leaders navigated a world without borders, without instant communication, and without any guarantees. Their triumphs and failures hold timeless lessons about the cost of deceit, the value of trust, and how easily the threads of diplomacy can fray when honesty is sacrificed. So let's step into their world where every word mattered and every promise carried the weight of empires. The collapse of the Bronze Age didn't just happen, it was a slow unraveling, one lie at a time. The golden age of Bronze Age diplomacy didn't happen by accident. It was a carefully crafted web of relationships where every gesture carried weight. Kings didn't just send letters, they orchestrated grand displays of generosity, exchanging lavish gifts like ivory, gold, and even exotic animals to prove their wealth and goodwill. A single shipment of treasures could signal friendship, but it could also be a subtle power play, a way to remind rivals of who held the upper hand. The Amarna Letters, those remarkable clay tablets exchanged between pharaohs and their counterparts, are filled with flattering titles and poetic declarations of brotherhood. One Babylonian king wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh, "You are like the sun in the sky, and I am but a humble servant." Yet these flowery words often masked deeper calculations. Behind the scenes, royal marriages were another cornerstone of diplomacy. A princess sent to marry a foreign king wasn't just a bride, she was a living treaty, a guarantee of peace between two powers. But these alliances were fragile. When a Hittite prince was murdered on his way to marry an Egyptian princess, it nearly sparked a war. Trust was always conditional, and every kingdom kept a mental ledger of favors given and debts owed. The Assyrians, for instance, were masters of this game, using gifts and marriages to expand their influence while carefully avoiding outright conflict. Yet the system's greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. Diplomacy relied on a delicate balance of power, where every player had to believe that keeping the peace was more valuable than breaking it. But as resources grew scarce and external threats like the mysterious sea peoples loomed, that balance began to waver. A Hittite king might beg Egypt for grain in one letter, then accuse them of sending inferior gold in the next. Vassal states, tired of paying tribute, started hedging their bets, sending vague promises to multiple overlords. The cracks were showing long before the collapse, hidden beneath layers of polished clay and polished words. What started as a golden age of connection ended as a cautionary tale, proof that even the most elaborate diplomacy can't survive when the foundation of trust begins to crumble. In the intricate dance of Bronze Age diplomacy, a gift was never just a gift. It was a message written in gold, a silent language of power and intention. When the Pharaoh of Egypt sent a chest of lapis lazuli to the king of Babylon, he wasn't merely being generous. He was demonstrating his access to rare treasures, subtly reminding his counterpart of Egypt's wealth and reach. These exchanges followed an unspoken code. The more extravagant the gift, the greater the respect, or the sharper the underlying threat. A Hittite ruler might send a finely crafted silver vessel to an ally, but if that same vessel arrived with less weight or craftsmanship than expected, it could ignite a diplomatic crisis. The archives of Ugarit reveal how one king complained bitterly that the gold sent to him was not fit for a servant, a slight that demanded immediate redress. But the stakes went beyond mere pride. Gifts were the glue holding alliances together, a tangible promise of mutual support. When the Mitanni kingdom sent horses and chariots to Egypt, it wasn't just about impressing the pharaoh. It was about ensuring military cooperation against common enemies. Yet this system relied on perfect equilibrium. The moment one side failed to reciprocate, the entire relationship teetered. A letter from the Babylonian king Bernabariash to Akhenaten lays bare the tension. Why have you sent me only 20 talents of gold? When my ancestors and yours treated one another as brothers, they sent far more. The subtext was clear. A diminished gift signaled diminished regard, and in a world where perception dictated power, that was a dangerous precedent. Perhaps most fascinating was how gifts doubled as surveillance. Exotic items like the elephants sent from Syria to Egypt weren't just displays of wealth, they were tests. Could the recipient maintain such creatures? Did they have the resources to reciprocate? A king's ability to handle, display, or match a gift revealed his kingdom's strength or vulnerability. And when the flow of treasures slowed, as it did in the years leading up to the Bronze Age collapse, the silence spoke volumes. Gifts that once crossed borders by the caravan load dwindled to trickles, then stopped altogether. The networks of trust frayed, and with them, the bonds that had sustained empires. What began as a system to foster unity became, in the end, a stark ledger of broken promises, proof that even the most glittering tokens couldn't hold a crumbling world together. In the high-stakes world of Bronze Age diplomacy, words were weapons as sharp as any sword but far more precise. A single phrase, a misplaced title, or even the order in which a king listed his allies could tip the scales between peace and war. Take the Amarna Letters, where a Babylonian ruler addressed the Egyptian pharaoh as "my brother," but carefully noted that their fathers had exchanged proper gifts. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a coded reminder that past obligations still mattered. Meanwhile, the Hittites mastered the art of the backhanded compliment, praising an ally's strength while subtly questioning their loyalty in the same breath. The opening lines of these letters were anything but casual. A king who omitted another ruler's full list of titles risked sparking outrage, like the time the Mitanni king Tushratta scolded Amenhotep III for shortening his royal epithets, calling it an insult to my ancestors. Even the clay itself spoke volumes. Letters written in Babylonian cuneiform, the lingua franca of diplomacy, showed respect, while those sent in a ruler's native tongue often signaled either intimacy or defiance. And then there were the silences, the gaps where promises should have been. When the king of Elashia, modern Cyprus, repeatedly forgot to mention military aid in his replies to Egypt, the omission wasn't oversight, it was evasion. But the most revealing moments came when the polished language cracked. Amid the usual flourishes, "May the gods keep you in glorious health," sudden bursts of raw frustration exposed the truth. One Assyrian king, tired of waiting for Egyptian gold, dropped all pretense. "Why do you treat me like a thief? If we are brothers, act like it." These flashes of honesty were rare, but they laid bare the tensions simmering beneath the surface. For all their eloquence, these letters couldn't mask the growing distrust, and when the final crisis came, all the carefully crafted words in the world couldn't stitch the broken alliances back together. The collapse wasn't just a failure of politics, it was a failure of language itself, proof that when trust vanishes, even the most artful diplomacy is just clay waiting to crumble. Buried in the sands of Amana for over 3,000 years, these clay tablets were more than just ancient mail. They were a lifeline between empires, a desperate attempt to hold a fracturing world together. The Amarna Letters, written in the refined script of Akkadian cuneiform, reveal a diplomatic dance where every word was measured, every silence loaded with meaning. Take the plea from Rib-Hadda, the beleaguered ruler of Byblos, who wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh no fewer than 60 times, begging for troops against his enemies. His early letters were formal, even hopeful, but as the threats mounted and Egypt's responses grew colder, his tone shifted to desperation. "Why do you abandon me like a bird in a cage?" Meanwhile, the king of Babylon, Bernabariash, took a different tack, masking his demands in layers of flattery. "If gold is as plentiful as dust in your land," he wrote, "why do you hold it back from your brother?" Yet the most telling exchanges weren't the grand appeals between kings, they were the subtle betrayals hidden between the lines. When the Hittite king Suppiluliuma intercepted a letter meant for Egypt, he didn't just read it, he rewrote it, inserting false promises to destabilize the alliance. Other rulers played similar games, sending identical pledges of loyalty to rival powers, hedging their bets as the political winds shifted. The archive even preserves moments of startling candor, like when the Mitanni queen Tushratta accused Akhenaten of keeping her daughter like a hostage, rather than honoring her as a royal bride. These weren't just personal grievances, they were cracks in the system, signs that the old rules of reciprocity were breaking down. What makes the Amarna Letters so extraordinary isn't just their content, it's their timing. They capture the precise moment when diplomacy began to unravel, when the flow of gifts and soldiers slowed to a trickle, and words alone couldn't paper over the growing distrust. Kings who once addressed each other as brothers now traded accusations of deceit. Vassal states, once loyal, stopped answering missives altogether. And when the crisis finally came, when the so-called Sea Peoples razed cities and empires collapsed, the letters fell silent, their last unanswered pleas buried under ashes and time. In the end, these fragile tablets outlasted the very empires they sought to save, a haunting reminder that even the mightiest kingdoms are only as strong as the trust between them. The ink was barely dry on treaties when kings began looking for ways to bend or break their word. In the Bronze Age, promises carved into clay weren't sacred bonds but temporary calculations, waiting to be overturned by the next shift in power. Take the Hittites, masters of realpolitik, who would swear eternal friendship to Egypt while quietly funneling weapons to Egyptian rebels. When the pharaoh protested, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma shrugged it off with a chilling pragmatism. Kings have no permanent allies, only permanent interests. This wasn't an isolated incident. The archives of Ugarit reveal how a single betrayal could cascade into disaster, like when the king of Carchemish pledged troops to defend his ally, only to withdraw them last minute, leaving the city vulnerable to raiders. The excuses were as creative as they were cynical. A king might blame bandits for seized tribute caravans his own soldiers had ambushed. Others exploited loopholes, like the ruler who delayed sending grain because the treaty specified harvest time but failed to define which year's harvest. Even marriage alliances meant to bind kingdoms through blood became tools of deception. One Mitanni princess, sent to marry an Egyptian pharaoh, arrived with a retinue of spies who mapped out military positions under the guise of delivering wedding gifts. But the cost of these betrayals mounted quickly. When vassal states realized their overlords wouldn't protect them, they stopped paying tribute, crippling the economies of empires built on that wealth. Trade routes, once guarded by mutual interest, became lawless highways where merchants traveled in armed convoys or not at all. The most telling example comes from Cyprus, where copper shipments to Egypt dropped by 70% as piracy soared and trust evaporated. What began as isolated acts of opportunism snowballed into a systemic collapse. Kings who once feared breaking oaths now feared being the last one to keep them. The Hittite capital Hattusa, once a hub of diplomacy, burned to the ground amid rebellions by abandoned allies. Egypt, stretched thin, propping up faltering partnerships, retreated behind its borders. By the time invaders like the Sea Peoples arrived, the Bronze Age world had already gutted itself from within, not with swords, but with broken promises. The lesson written in those ashes: a treaty is only as strong as the fear of breaking it, and when that fear vanishes, so does everything else. Brotherhood in the Bronze Age was less a bond of kinship and more a carefully crafted illusion, a diplomatic costume kings wore when it suited them. The Mitanni kingdom learned this the hard way. Once a dominant power, its allies melted away like wax under fire when the Hittites turned their armies toward Mitanni lands. King Tushratta, who had exchanged lavish gifts and effusive letters with Egypt's pharaohs, found himself begging for help that never came. His desperate plea, "If you are truly my brother, send me chariots, for the enemy is at my gates," was met with silence. Egypt, preoccupied with its own troubles, calculated that saving Mitanni wasn't worth the cost. Even the most sacred oaths crumbled under pressure. The Hittites and Egyptians famously swore a treaty so binding they invoked over 1,000 gods to witness it, threatening divine wrath on any who broke its terms. Yet within decades, both sides were skirting its edges, the Hittites by harboring Egyptian rebels, Egypt by withholding promised grain shipments. Vassal states played an even riskier game. The ruler of Ugarit, pledged to both Hittite and Egyptian overlords, sent identical promises of loyalty to each, gambling that chaos would shield his duplicity. When the Hittites demanded his troops, he claimed pirates had stolen his ships. When Egypt called for tribute, he blamed poor harvests, the darkest irony. These betrayals often backfired spectacularly. By abandoning Mitanni, Egypt left a power vacuum the Hittites eagerly filled, putting them closer to Egypt's own borders. Kings who reneged on grain promises later found their own people starving when droughts hit. The system relied on mutual vulnerability, a balance where everyone needed everyone else. But once that delicate equilibrium shattered, the collapse came swiftly. Treaties became scraps of clay, brotherhood a hollow joke, and the empires that had once traded gold and daughters were left with nothing but ashes and regret. The lesson was clear: in a world without trust, even the mightiest kingdoms were just one betrayal away from ruin. Every royal court had its shadows men who moved like whispers, gathering secrets as others gathered gold. In the Bronze Age, espionage wasn't just a tool of war, it was the lifeblood of diplomacy. Kings who exchanged flowery letters by day sent spies by night to verify every promise, every threat. The Hittites elevated this game to an art form. Their agents, often disguised as merchants or diplomats, infiltrated rival courts, reporting back on troop movements, grain stores, even the private grievances of foreign nobles. One surviving tablet from Hattusa boasts how a single spy, posing as a copper trader, convinced a rebellious vassal to reveal his allies, names the Hittites then used to dismantle the entire conspiracy. But information was a volatile currency. The same networks that fed kings' intelligence also fed their paranoia. A Babylonian ruler, after discovering a plot among his own advisors, began seeing traitors everywhere. He demanded his scribes write letters in secret codes, changed messengers weekly, and even suspected his queen of passing messages to her homeland. The archives of Mari reveal how one king's obsession with spies backfired spectacularly. He executed 3 innocent envoys on suspicion of espionage, only to realize too late they carried genuine peace offers from a neighbor now bent on revenge. Espionage's greatest irony: the more it succeeded, the more it eroded the trust diplomacy needed to survive. When the king of Ugarit intercepted a letter proving his Egyptian allies were negotiating behind his back, he didn't confront them, he quietly began talks with the Hittites instead. Secrets bred more secrets, lies spawned bigger lies, until no one could distinguish friend from foe. Even gifts became suspect. A beautifully carved chest might hide listening ears, a shipment of wine could carry poisoned words. By the late Bronze Age, the very system meant to stabilize empires had become a hall of mirrors, where every reflection was a distortion, and every truth was just a lie waiting to be uncovered. The lesson written in these ancient shadows: knowledge is power, but only if you can trust the hands that gather it. When suspicion outpaces cooperation, even the best intelligence becomes a weapon turned inward, unraveling the alliances it was meant to protect. The spies of the Bronze Age didn't just watch history unfold, they helped write its darkest chapters, one whispered betrayal at a time. The lavish gifts that once flowed between kingdoms, gold, ivory, precious stones, were more than just tokens of goodwill. They were the lifeblood of Bronze Age diplomacy. But as the climate shifted and droughts gripped the eastern Mediterranean, the economic foundations of this system began to crumble. Famine records from Hattusa describe barren fields and empty granaries, while Egyptian papyri tell of the Nile failing to reach its usual flood levels. Kings who had once competed to outgift one another now faced a brutal calculus: feed their own people or uphold their diplomatic obligations. The ruler of Ugarit captured this desperation in a letter to his ally in Cyprus: "There is no grain left in our land. If you do not send ships, we will perish." Trade routes, once buzzing with caravans laden with treasures, grew dangerously quiet. The copper mines of Cyprus, which supplied empires with vital metal for weapons and tools, slowed production as fuel for smelting became scarce. Ships carrying tin from Afghanistan, essential for bronze making, were hijacked by pirates or simply never arrived. Even Egypt, long insulated by the Nile's abundance, saw its surplus vanish. A scribe in Thebes recorded the shocking moment when a pharaoh sent a shipment of gold to the Hittites only to have it returned, not out of pride, but because the Hittites needed grain instead, and Egypt had none to spare. The collapse of this gift economy had cascading consequences. When the king of Babylon received a paltry sum of gold from Egypt, he didn't just take offense, he recalculated the entire alliance. Vassal states, once kept loyal by regular shipments of food and weapons, began ignoring their overlord's commands. The archives of Amana reveal how one local governor, tired of empty promises, wrote bluntly, "Why should we send tribute to a king who cannot even protect his own cities?" Worst of all, the scarcity bred a deadly cynicism. Kings who once competed in generosity now hoarded resources, each suspecting the other of doing the same. The Hittites, desperate to maintain their army, demanded ever more tribute from vassals already on the brink, accelerating rebellions. Egypt, retreating inward, diverted grain from allied ports to its own cities, sparking accusations of betrayal. By the time invaders like the Sea Peoples appeared on the horizon, the great powers were already shadows of their former selves, not just weakened by drought and famine, but paralyzed by the realization that the rules of the game had changed. The Age of Gold had ended, and in its place came an era of grim arithmetic, when survival trumped loyalty and diplomacy gave way to the stark law of the starving. The waves that brought the Sea Peoples to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean weren't just a military threat, they were a mirror, reflecting the fragility of a world already teetering on the edge. Historians still debate who these raiders were, refugees, mercenaries, or opportunistic invaders, but their impact was undeniable. They struck with terrifying precision, targeting coastal cities already weakened by famine and infighting. Ugarit, a wealthy port city and vital trade hub, sent one final panicked letter to its allies. "The enemy ships are here. They have set fire to our fields and villages." "Where are your troops?" The reply never came. Within weeks, Ugarit was reduced to smoldering ruins, its archives buried under collapsed walls, preserving its despair in baked clay. What made the Sea Peoples so devastating wasn't just their violence, it was the timing. They arrived at the precise moment when the old diplomatic networks had frayed beyond repair. The Hittites, once the dominant military power, were crippled by food shortages and rebellions in their vassal states. Egypt, under Pharaoh Ramses III, managed to repel the invaders in a desperate naval battle, but at a staggering cost. The reliefs at Medinet Habu tell the story. Waves of chaotic combat captured Sea Peoples in distinctive horned helmets, and a victory that felt more like survival than triumph. Even the proudest kingdoms now faced a grim reality. Their wealth and treaties meant nothing against an enemy that recognized no rules, no borders, and no mercy. The bitter irony, the Sea Peoples may have been a symptom of the collapse as much as its cause. Some scholars suggest they were themselves displaced by the same droughts and famines that had destabilized the great kingdoms, a domino effect of desperation. A Hittite text laments, "The sea has grown restless, spitting out strangers who eat the land like locusts." Whether invaders or refugees, they exposed the fatal weakness of Bronze Age diplomacy. It relied on stability. When the tides of fortune turned, the intricate web of alliances and gifts couldn't adapt. Kings who had spent generations outmaneuvering each other in letters now found themselves unprepared for an enemy that didn't negotiate, it simply destroyed. In the end, the Sea Peoples didn't just sack cities, they shattered an illusion. The carefully balanced system of brotherhood and betrayal, of gifts and spies, had no answer for chaos. The ruins they left behind, abandoned palaces, burned libraries, silent ports, were monuments to a sobering truth. Diplomacy, for all its artistry, is only as strong as the world that sustains it. And when that world crumbles, even the most cunning kings are left with nothing but ashes and the echoes of their own unmet promises. Distance turned even minor delays into major crises in the Bronze Age diplomatic world. A messenger delayed by sandstorms or bandits could inadvertently spark a royal feud, like the time the Babylonian king Kadashman Enlil nearly severed ties with Egypt over a missing reply. 6 times I sent my envoys, he fumed in a clay tablet, and 6 times they returned empty-handed. Is this how a brother treats his kin? The truth. Pharaoh Amenhotep III's responses had been waylaid by a rebellion in Canaan, but the damage was done. What began as logistical chaos morphed into a full-blown diplomatic incident, with Babylon withholding precious lapis lazuli shipments as retaliation. The stakes grew even higher when translations went awry. Diplomatic letters relied on scribes fluent in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the era, but nuance often got lost in transmission. One infamous case involved the Hittite queen Pujuhepa, whose carefully worded marriage proposal for her daughter was mangled by an Egyptian scribe's clumsy phrasing. Instead of highlighting the bride's royal lineage, the botched translation made her sound like a mere concubine. The insult nearly derailed negotiations until a bilingual envoy painstakingly reconstructed the original intent. Even the physical state of a letter could send unintended messages. A tablet cracked from rough transit might be misread as deliberate disrespect, while overly ornate script could imply the sender thought the recipient needed coddling. The king of Assyria once provoked Egyptian ire by sending a tablet with irregular margins, a subtle power play suggesting equality between rulers when Egypt expected submissive formatting. But the most dangerous miscommunications weren't in words at all, they were in silence. When the king of Mitanni stopped receiving his usual share of Egyptian gold, he assumed betrayal. In reality, Nile floods had ruined the mines. By the time explanations arrived, Mitanni had already pivoted to the Hittites, destabilizing the entire region. These cascading misunderstandings reveal a brutal truth. In an era without clarification, every gap in knowledge became fertile ground for suspicion. Diplomacy didn't just fail from lies, it unraveled from the spaces between words where imagination bred mistrust. Trust was once as valuable as gold in the Bronze Age world, until kings realized how easily it could be counterfeit. The archives of Hattusa tell a revealing story. When the Hittite king Mursili II discovered his Egyptian brother had been secretly arming his rebels, he didn't bother with indignant letters. Instead, he simply stopped sending the annual shipments of Anatolian silver that had flowed for generations. No explanation, no negotiation, just silence. This wasn't petty retaliation, it was a seismic shift. The unspoken rules of diplomacy, which had survived centuries, were now being rewritten in real time. What made this erosion so devastating was its predictability. Every betrayal set a precedent, teaching rulers that survival required skepticism. The king of Ugarit, once a loyal Hittite vassal, began keeping 2 sets of records, one for his overlords, another with secret pacts with Egypt. When the Hittites demanded troops, he'd send just enough to avoid suspicion, but never enough to weaken his own defenses. This calculated half-compliance became the new normal. Even the most solemn oaths sworn before entire pantheons of gods lost their weight. A treaty between Egypt and Hatti invoked over 1,000 deities as witnesses, yet within years, both sides were passing its clauses like lawyers, searching for loopholes to exploit. The final stage of collapse came when deception wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. A Babylonian ruler, receiving a lavish gift from Assyria, immediately ordered his scribes to test the gold for purity, assuming deception as default. Diplomatic marriages, once celebrated with public feasts, became tense, guarded affairs where brides traveled with armed escorts, not dowries. The Amarna Letters capture this downward spiral perfectly. Early correspondence brims with poetic affection, but later tablets read like Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, business contracts, devoid of even ceremonial warmth. Perhaps the most tragic casualty was the loss of collective security. When invaders threatened smaller kingdoms, they no longer trusted their so-called protectors to intervene. A desperate plea from the ruler of Assyria to Egypt survives in the ruins. "The enemy is at my walls. Where are the ships you promised?" The reply, if there was one, is lost to history, but the charred remains of Assyria's palaces suggest the answer. By the time the Sea Peoples arrived, the great powers had already abandoned each other in all but name. The treaties still existed, carved in stone and clay, but the belief that anyone would honor them had long since turned to dust. This wasn't just the end of an era, it was the failure of an idea. For centuries, Bronze Age kings had believed that mutual interest could transcend ambition. But when crisis came, they discovered a darker truth. Trust, once broken, is far harder to rebuild than any city wall. The ruins of Hattusa, Ugarit, and Mycenae stand as monuments not to conquest, but to the slow, self-inflicted death of faith between nations. And in their ashes lay the bitter lesson that diplomacy without trust is merely theater, a performance where every actor knows the lines, but no one believes the play. For every grand alliance between great kings, there were a dozen smaller rebellions simmering in the shadows, vassal states, waiting for the moment to shake off their chains. The Amarna Letters crackle with these tensions, like the furious missive from Ribhadda of Byblos, who wrote to the pharaoh, "My own servants have turned against me, and my cities rebel while you sit silent." His words weren't just panic, they were a warning. Vassals weren't passive subjects, they were calculating players who knew the value of their loyalty. When the Hittites cut off grain shipments to a restive Syrian city, its ruler didn't beg for forgiveness. He opened secret talks with Egypt, offering double the tribute in exchange for protection. The real danger came when rebellions turned contagious. A single successful revolt, like the uprising in Nuhash, emboldened others. The Hittite king had to divert troops from his Egyptian frontier to crush the rebellion, weakening his position elsewhere. Meanwhile, opportunistic neighbors like Assyria watched closely, ready to swoop in when overlords were distracted. One Amana tablet captures this domino effect perfectly. After the king of Katna overthrew his Hittite governor, 3 nearby cities followed within months. The scribe's despairing note, "Now even the dogs bark at our envoys," speaks volumes about how quickly respect for authority vanished. But the greatest threat wasn't the rebellions themselves, it was how they exposed the hypocrisy of the system. Vassals were expected to remain loyal while receiving dwindling protection. When the pharaoh ignored pleas from Canaanite cities being raided by the Aparu renegades and mercenaries, those cities did the unthinkable. They hired the Aparu as their own militia. The irony was brutal. The very outlaws kings had vowed to exterminate became the enforcers of their former victims. By the late Bronze Age, this cycle of neglect and revolt had reached a breaking point. Overstretched empires could no longer police their frontiers, and vassals stopped pretending obedience. The archives of Ugarit record a chilling exchange between its king and a Hittite general demanding troops. "You know our cities are undefended. What exactly are we paying you for?" The reply, if any, is lost to history, but the ruins of Ugarit suggest how that conversation ended. Diplomacy's fatal flaw wasn't just the lies between kings, it was the broken promises to those beneath them, the ones who finally decided no empire was better than a failing one. The Hittite Empire didn't collapse in a day, it unraveled thread by thread. Each snapped bond a lesson in the limits of power. At its height, this Anatolian powerhouse commanded vassals from Syria to the Aegean, its iron-fisted diplomacy backed by the most feared chariot corps of the Bronze Age. But strength became its own weakness. The Hittite strategy relied on a delicate balance: offer protection to smaller states in exchange for loyalty, but never let any single vassal grow strong enough to challenge them. It worked until it didn't. The first cracks appeared in the Levant, where client kings began playing Egypt and Hittite against each other. One rebellious governor, caught between Hittite demands and Egyptian bribes, summed up the era's cynicism in a letter to his overlord: "You ask for troops, but what have your troops ever done for me?" What sealed the Hittites' fate wasn't just external pressure, it was their own inflexibility. When famine struck Anatolia in the late 13th century BC, instead of easing tribute demands, they doubled down. Tablets from Hattusa reveal increasingly desperate orders to Syrian vassals: send grain immediately or face the consequences, but the consequences never came. The Hittite army, stretched thin putting down revolts, couldn't enforce its threats. By the time King Suppiluliuma II took the throne, entire regions had simply stopped replying to missives. One clay tablet from Ugarit captures the absurdity: a Hittite commander's plea for help against invaders, sent to a vassal whose city had already burned to the ground. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter: the Kaskians, mountain tribes the Hittites had long dismissed as barbarians. With the empire's attention fixed on Syrian rebellions and Egyptian rivalries, these guerrilla fighters swept down from the north, sacking Hattusa itself. Archaeologists found the capital's gates still sealed, evidence the Hittites never saw the attack coming. Their meticulous diplomatic archives, filled with treaties and spy reports, proved useless against an enemy that didn't negotiate. Yet the true tragedy lies in what happened next. Unlike Egypt, which weathered the Bronze Age collapse by falling back on its Nile fortress, the Hittites vanished so completely that scholars once doubted they'd existed at all. Their fate warns us that empires built on control, not trust, leave no one to mourn their passing. When the last Hittite stronghold fell, not a single vassal sent troops to its defense, just silence and the quiet rustle of wind through abandoned clay tablets. Egypt stood as the last great pillar of the Bronze Age world, its Nile-fed wealth and military might seemingly unshakable, until the cracks began to show. Pharaoh Ramses III, often hailed as Egypt's final mighty ruler, inherited an empire straining under the weight of its own diplomacy. The very alliances that had once secured Egypt's dominance now bled it dry. Consider the Hittite Treaty, a masterpiece of statecraft that obligated Egypt to ship vast quantities of grain northward each year. When drought parched the Nile's floods, Ramses faced an impossible choice: feed his people or honor his word. He chose the latter, a decision etched in the desperate graffiti of Theban tomb workers who rioted when their rations dwindled. The royal court, once a well-oiled machine of governance, became a nest of intrigue. A surviving papyrus details the shocking harem conspiracy, where secondary wives and officials plotted to assassinate Ramses and crown a puppet pharaoh. This wasn't just palace drama, it was symptomatic of a system losing faith in itself. Even the Medjay, Egypt's elite paramilitary force, grew unreliable as payments in silver and grain grew erratic. A commander's letter from Nubia reads like a cry into the void: "My men have not eaten in 3 days. How long before they desert?" External pressures compounded these internal fissures. The cost of repelling successive waves of sea peoples drained Egypt's treasuries. Temple reliefs at Medinet Habu boast of victories, but the fine print tells another story. Lists of captured weapons reveal most were recycled Egyptian arms, evidence of a kingdom scraping the barrel for supplies. Meanwhile, Canaanite vassals along the buffer zone of Egypt's empire stopped sending tribute altogether. A clay tablet from Gaza spells out their defiance. Why should we send copper to a king who cannot stop our villages from burning? What makes Egypt's decline so revealing is its slow-motion inevitability. Unlike the Hittite sudden collapse, Egypt's unraveling played out over decades, a testament to its resilience and to the limits of that resilience. The pharaohs kept up appearances, commissioning grand monuments even as their foreign holdings slipped away. But the diplomatic letters tell the truth. Where once they addressed other kings as equals, late-era pharaohs resorted to empty bluster, calling themselves lions among jackals, while their influence shrank to the Nile's banks. The bitter lesson: even the mightiest empire cannot outlast the erosion of trust. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse not through diplomacy, but by retreating behind its natural fortresses, the deserts and the Nile. Its final pharaohs ruled a hollowed-out shell, their once global ambitions reduced to controlling the next harvest. The treaties that had built their empire became relics, reminders of a world where words still had weight. And when that world vanished, Egypt stood alone, a colossus with no one left to impress. While the great powers of the Bronze Age crumbled under the weight of their own failed diplomacy, a shadow was growing in the north, Assyria, a kingdom that would rewrite the rules of power. While others clung to the fading ideals of brotherhood and reciprocity, the Assyrian kings saw opportunity in the chaos. Their letters reveal none of the poetic flourishes of Amana diplomacy. Instead, they read like military dispatches, terse, direct, and utterly pragmatic. When King Ashur-uballit I seized the throne, he didn't bother with gifts or marriage alliances to secure his borders. He sent chariots. What set the Assyrians apart wasn't just their brutality, it was their ruthless understanding of human nature. They recognized that vassals kept in line by fear were more reliable than those bound by fragile oaths. A tablet from the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I boasts how he replaced a rebellious city's entire ruling class with Assyrian governors, then publicly displayed the previous leader's severed hands as a warning. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was calculated psychology. Where Hittite or Egyptian rulers might spend years negotiating with troublesome vassals, the Assyrians simply removed the problem permanently. Their mastery of information gave them an edge their predecessors lacked. While Bronze Age kings relied on sporadic spy reports, the Assyrians institutionalized surveillance. Provincial governors were required to send daily updates on local grain stores, troop movements, even gossip about potential dissent. One clay tablet preserves a governor's frantic message about a brewing plot, intercepted because a tavern keeper had been paid to report suspicious conversations. This web of informants allowed Assyria to strike before rebellions could spread, turning reactive diplomacy into proactive domination. Yet the true genius of Assyrian realpolitik lay in their economic strategy. Instead of relying on the crumbling gift exchange system, they built a war machine fueled by systematic plunder. Conquered cities weren't just punished, they were integrated into a vast supply chain. A single campaign by Shalmaneser III brought in 14 tons of silver, enough to fund years of further expansion. While Egypt starved and the Hittites fractured, Assyria grew stronger with each victory, turning the chaos of collapse into a ladder for ascent. The lesson etched into their rise is as stark as their stone reliefs. When trust becomes impossible, control is the only currency left. The Assyrians didn't mourn the death of Bronze Age diplomacy, they weaponized its failure. Their chariots rolled over the ashes of Hattusa, their taxes drained the ruins of Ugarit, and their scribes recorded it all without a trace of nostalgia. In the end, they proved one brutal truth: civilizations built on broken promises don't need new alliances, they just need sharper swords. The rain stopped coming long before the wars began, a slow, silent crisis that no treaty could fix. Tree rings from ancient Anatolia tell the story. 3 straight decades of drought in the late 13th century BCE, years when the earth cracked and rivers ran dry. For empires built on grain and trade, this wasn't just hardship, it was existential. The Hittite capital Hattusa, dependent on harvests from surrounding plains, saw its granaries empty while its king scrambled to buy wheat from Egypt. A desperate letter survives: "Send me ships laden with grain, for my people are eating their own children." But Egypt, its own Nile floods failing, had nothing to spare. Diplomacy, for all its artistry, couldn't negotiate with the sky. Famine didn't just starve bodies, it starved trust. When the king of Ugarit received a demand for troops from his Hittite overlord, he fired back an unprecedented refusal. "How can I feed your soldiers when my own city starves?" Vassal states that had obeyed for generations now prioritized survival over loyalty. The archives of Amana reveal how local governors hoarded grain, selling it to the highest bidder while their people rioted. Even the sacred guest friendship traditions, where rulers were obligated to feed foreign envoys, collapsed under the strain. A Babylonian diplomat's report describes arriving at Assyrian court only to be given a cup of muddy water and moldy bread, an insult that would have meant war in better times. Then came the domino effect, migrations that turned into invasions. As farmlands turned to dust, entire populations took to the roads. The infamous Sea Peoples may have been as much climate refugees as warriors, pushed from their homelands by crop failures. A Hittite tablet describes strange tongues moving like locusts, destroying villages not out of malice but desperation. Cities that once welcomed traders now barred their gates, fearing hungry mobs more than diplomatic consequences. The ruler of Alashiya wrote to Egypt, "We cannot distinguish friend from foe, for every stranger comes with empty hands and hungry eyes," the cruelest irony. The very treaties meant to ensure mutual aid became liabilities. When the Hittites invoked their grain agreement with Egypt, Pharaoh Merneptah had to choose between honoring his word and feeding his army. He sent a token shipment rotting, an insect-ridden, a symbolic gesture that only deepened the rift. Meanwhile, Assyria, blessed with rain-fed Tigris valleys, watched its rivals weaken and pounced. Their king's boast says it all. "While others beg for bread, my storehouses overflow. Let them eat their treaties." By the time the earthquakes came shattering cities already weakened by neglect, the collapse was inevitable. Nature had done what no army could, exposed the fragility of human promises. The ruins of Bronze Age palaces aren't just monuments to war or betrayal, but to a deeper truth. Civilizations can survive the failings of kings, but even the mightiest empires kneel before drought and famine. The lesson written in those parched fields and silent ports. Diplomacy is a fair weather craft. When the storms come, even the most carefully woven alliances can unravel like thread in the wind. By the 12th century BC, the carefully orchestrated dance of Bronze Age diplomacy had become a shadow play. Kings still moved their pieces, but the board itself was breaking apart. In the final days of Hattusa, scribes continued drafting letters to Egypt as if routines could ward off disaster, even as invaders camped outside the city walls. One fragmentary tablet captures the surreal disconnect, a Hittite official politely inquiring about the pharaoh's health while adding, almost as an afterthought, "We are burning our archives to keep warm." The contrast couldn't be starker: centuries of painstaking alliance building reduced to ashes in a single winter. Egypt's retreat behind its borders marked the end of an era. Pharaohs who had once hosted lavish receptions for foreign envoys now barred the gates of the Nile Delta, posting guards to turn away desperate refugees. A jarring administrative note from Pi-Ramses records the new policy: "Let no Asiatic cross the fortress walls, lest they bring the chaos of the outside world within." The same kingdom that had traded gold for lapis lazuli with Babylon now hoarded its wealth, paying mercenaries in stale bread and promises. Even the language of diplomacy withered, where letters once overflowed with poetic declarations of brotherhood. Late-period missives were blunt transactions. A Mycenaean ruler's last known message to Egypt survives as a single line: "Send tin. We have nothing left to offer in return." The smaller states fared worse. Ugarit, that bustling hub of international trade, became a cautionary tale. Its final diplomatic dispatch, an unanswered plea for help against invading ships, was found still baking in the kiln, never sent. Nearby, the king of Alashia resorted to melting down temple artifacts to pay pirate crews for protection, a far cry from the days when his ancestors dined with pharaohs. These weren't just political collapses, they were the death throes of an entire way of navigating the world. What emerged from the ruins was a landscape unrecognizable to Bronze Age kings. The great powers that survived did so by shedding their cosmopolitan pasts. Egypt became insular, its foreign policy reduced to carving victory hymns about imaginary battles while real enemies picked at its carcass. Assyria, the exception, rose precisely because it rejected the old rules where others had built alliances. It built barracks. The elegant cuneiform of Amarna-era letters gave way to crude stone reliefs of conquered cities, a visual shorthand for a brutal new order. Yet in this unraveling lies a paradox. The same collapse that destroyed palaces also freed smaller cultures from imperial shadows. The Phoenicians, once bit players in great power games, reinvented themselves as master navigators. Their alphabet, simplified from Egyptian hieroglyphs, would outlast both empires. In Greece, the fall of Mycenaean warlords allowed village councils to experiment with early democracy. The end of Bronze Age diplomacy didn't just bring darkness, it cleared the ground for seeds no one knew were waiting. The last clay tablet ever sent between great kings may still lie buried somewhere, its words forever unread, but its message echoes through history nonetheless. No system, however intricate, survives when the trust at its heart turns to dust. The gifts stop coming, the titles ring hollow, and one day the messengers simply stop arriving. The collapse of Bronze Age diplomacy reads like a cautionary treatise for our modern world, not because history repeats itself, but because human nature remains stubbornly consistent. Consider the parallels, like those ancient kings exchanging clay tablets. Today's leaders rely on encrypted cables and summit meetings, yet the same pitfalls lurk beneath the surface. When the Hittites discovered Egyptian gold shipments contained inferior ore, it wasn't just a financial slight, it eroded centuries of carefully cultivated trust. Fast forward to modern trade wars, where accusations of currency manipulation or tariff violations achieve the same corrosive effect. The lesson: trust, once broken, doesn't shatter like pottery, it dissolves like salt in water, leaving no visible trace but fundamentally altering the chemistry of relationships. Alliances built solely on convenience rather than shared values crumble under pressure, a truth as evident in Bronze Age Syria as in contemporary geopolitics. The Mitanni kingdom learned this the hard way when its marriage alliance with Egypt collapsed amid crisis, revealing that ceremonial bonds meant little without mutual commitment. Today's transactional partnerships, where nations collaborate one day and undermine each other the next, face the same fragility. The Assyrians thrived precisely because they rejected this model, opting for ruthless consistency over fleeting alliances. Their rise whispers a harsh truth: in times of upheaval, clarity of purpose outweighs the illusion of friendship. Adaptability, or the lack thereof, sealed the fate of Bronze Age powers. Egypt's rigid adherence to pharaonic grandeur left it ill-prepared for the chaos of climate change and migration. much like modern states struggling with rising seas and displaced populations. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians, once minor players, reinvented themselves as maritime innovators when the old systems failed. Their survival underscores a vital principle. Resilience isn't about strength alone, but the capacity to pivot when the world shifts. Perhaps the most poignant warning from the Bronze Age collapse is the danger of siloed thinking. Kings who hoarded grain instead of sharing it during famine didn't just starve their neighbors. They destabilized the entire region, inviting invasion. Today's vaccine hoarding and resource nationalism echo this short-sightedness, proving that crises respect no borders. The clay tablets of Ugarit, abandoned mid-sentence, remind us that no civilization is too grand to fail when it prioritizes self-interest over collective survival. The choice facing modern diplomacy isn't just about avoiding ancient mistakes. It's about recognizing that the stakes are higher than ever, and the tablets recording our actions may one day be just as silent. 3,000 years may separate us from the Bronze Age, but the playbook of power remains eerily familiar. Modern diplomats might trade emails instead of clay tablets, yet the delicate dance of alliances operates on the same precarious principles. Take NATO Collective Defense Clause on paper, as binding as any Hittite-Egyptian treaty sworn before 1,000 gods. But when Turkey invoked Article 4 in 2012 over Syrian border tensions, the hesitant responses from some members echoed the half-hearted troop dispatches of Bronze Age vassals. The unspoken question hung in the air then as it does now. When crisis comes, will the ink on parchment prove stronger than self-interest? Trade agreements reveal even starker parallels. The Amarna Letters complaints about fake gold shipments find their mirror in modern accusations of tariff dodging or intellectual property theft. China's Belt and Road Initiative, with its infrastructure for influence deals, follows the same blueprint as Hittite grain shipments to dependent city-states' generosity with strings attached. And just as Bronze Age kings discovered, these arrangements work splendidly until the first economic storm hits. When Sri Lanka defaulted on Chinese port loans in 2022, the ensuing debt diplomacy scandals showed how quickly win-win projects can become leverage in the wrong hands. Climate change adds another layer of resonance. The drought-stricken Hittite pleas for Egyptian grain read like early drafts of today's climate refugee crises. Small island nations facing rising seas now issue the same desperate appeals that Bronze Age coastal cities once sent to inland powers, except today's sea peoples aren't invaders, but hurricanes and crop failures. The bitter irony, our globalized world has far more tools to address these threats than the Bronze Age ever did, yet we repeat their fatal hesitation. When Pacific nations begged for emissions cuts at recent UN summits, the responses from industrial powers carried the same qualified sympathy as Pharaoh Merneptah's half-empty grain ships. Perhaps the most sobering lesson lies in how systems collapse. The Bronze Age didn't fall to a single catastrophe, but to a cascade of small failures. A missed shipment here, a broken promise there. Our interconnected world faces similar fragility. When Russia cut gas supplies to Europe in 2022, it wasn't just about energy. It exposed how easily modern supply chains can become weapons. The Hittites would recognize the tactic. They once embargoed Anatolian silver to pressure Assyria, only to spark a black market that undermined their own economy. Yet amid these cautionary tales glimmers a crucial difference. Bronze Age kings had no way to verify distant events beyond unreliable messengers. Today, satellite imagery and instant communication make deception harder, in theory. Instead, we've invented subtler forms of misdirection. Cyber attacks disguised as civilian hackers, proxy wars with plausible deniability, the Assyrians would admire the sophistication. The challenge now isn't just avoiding ancient mistakes, but recognizing how technology amplifies both risks and opportunities. When every tweet can spark a diplomatic incident, we're all Bronze Age scribes drafting on cracked clay, except the stakes are higher, and the whole world is reading over our shoulders. Archaeologists are rewriting the story of Bronze Age diplomacy one fragment at a time, using tools the ancients could never have imagined. In the ruins of Hattusa, multispectral imaging has resurrected words from fire-scorched tablets, once deemed illegible, revealing a desperate Hittite plea to Egypt that changes our understanding of their final days. "The enemy is inside our gates," reads one newly deciphered line, "and your ships still have not come." This isn't just a cry for help. It's evidence that diplomatic ties held until the bitter end, even as physical walls crumbled. Meanwhile, in Cyprus, ground-penetrating radar uncovered a trove of letters beneath a collapsed palace, showing how the king of Assyria secretly played Egypt and the Hittites against each other while his island starved. The real breakthroughs come from combining these texts with scientific data. Pollen analysis from Anatolian lake beds confirms the severity of droughts mentioned in royal correspondence, while lead isotopes in Egyptian silver trace the sudden collapse of trade networks. A single shipment of bullion, analyzed with modern spectrometry, tells two stories. Its origin in defunct Anatolian mines proves the Hittites were still exporting precious metals even as their empire disintegrated. Even the clay itself speaks. Geochemical fingerprints reveal that urgent missives between Ugarit and Egypt were written on local mud, not the fine imported clay reserved for formal treaties, suggesting how hastily these final pleas were drafted. Perhaps most startling are the invisible inks of antiquity, words pressed so lightly into damp clay that they vanished over millennia. At Tel Brak in Syria, reflectance transformation imaging has exposed faint treaty clauses where a vassal king promised troops when the harvest allows, a loophole he exploited when famine struck. These ghostly impressions expose the quiet unraveling of commitments, one ambiguous phrase at a time. Similarly, CT scans of sealed diplomatic pouches in Thebes show some tablets were never opened, their seals intact, their warnings unread. Every layer of dirt holds contradictions. In 2021, a shipwreck off Uluburan yielded a cargo that rewrote trade maps, Mycenaean swords alongside Egyptian gold weights, all carefully inventoried on a wax-coated writing board. This wasn't pirate loot but an official shipment, proving that even amid collapse, someone still believed in the rules. Yet 50 miles away, the scorched remains of a merchant caravan tell the opposite story. Its Assyrian guards killed mid-journey, their tin ingots stolen not by raiders but by the very vassals tasked with protecting them. The greatest revelation may be how ordinary people navigated the chaos. At Tel Twaini in Syria, a farmer's house preserved a humble receipt, one jar of olive oil for 3 days' protection. No king's name, no grand alliance, just a local deal made as the old order faded. These fragments force us to reconsider the collapse not as a single event, but as a mosaic of countless small failures. A trader's ledger here, an unpaid mercenary's complaint there, until the weight of broken promises became too heavy for civilizations to bear. The lesson emerging from the dirt isn't just about how diplomacy failed, but how long it kept trying, right up until the moment the fires burned low and the scribes laid down their style for good. Debates over the Bronze Age collapse rage as fiercely today as the battles that toppled its citadels. Walk into any archaeology conference, and you'll find scholars divided into camps like modern-day Hittites and Egyptians, each armed with compelling evidence for their version of the apocalypse. The invasion theorists point to the Sea People's destruction layers at site after site, their charred pottery and arrowheads littering ruined palaces. Yet climate scientists counter with tree ring data showing decades of drought that would have turned fertile kingdoms into tinderboxes. Meanwhile, political historians highlight the Amarna Letters' mounting desperation, proof that the system was rotting from within long before any invaders arrived. The most convincing arguments emerge when these perspectives collide. Take the Hittite Empire's fall. Traditional narratives blamed the Kaskian tribe's assault on Hattusa, but soil samples from Anatolia tell a grimmer story. Pollen analysis reveals the capital's grain fields failed 3 years running before its fall, forcing the Hittites to abandon frontier forts to feed the core, leaving the gates wide open for attack. Similarly, Egypt's victory over the Sea Peoples at the Battle of the Delta looks less triumphant when temple reliefs are read alongside worker strike records. Pharaoh Ramses III may have saved his borders, but the unpaid laborers who built his monuments wrote of empty bellies and broken promises, hinting at internal fractures no enemy could exploit. Recent scholarship adds fascinating wrinkles to the debate. Some researchers now argue that bronze itself doomed these civilizations. The alloy required tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus, a supply chain vulnerable to disruption. When trade networks faltered, armies couldn't repair weapons, farmers couldn't fix tools, and the entire technological foundation crumbled. Others highlight a social contagion theory. As key cities fell, the psychological impact may have triggered panic migrations and preemptive abandonments. The ruins of Miletus show no signs of battle, just orderly departures, as if its residents saw neighboring cities burn and simply walked away. Perhaps what makes this collapse so endlessly debatable is that it holds up a mirror to our own anxieties. Climate historians see parallels in modern desertification, political scientists in failing alliances, and economists in fragile global supply chains. The lesson isn't that any single factor topples civilizations, but that their interconnectedness creates cascading vulnerabilities. When the Hittite king wrote, "We are drowning in darkness," he wasn't describing one disaster, but a perfect storm of invasions, famine, and betrayal, a reminder that history's greatest collapses are never simple, and their warnings never straightforward. The ruins of Bronze Age palaces may have crumbled to dust, but the ghost of their diplomacy never truly vanished. Those clay tablets inscribed with treaties weren't just forgotten relics, they became the blueprint for how nations would negotiate for millennia to come. Take the very idea of ambassadors, a concept we take for granted today. The Hittites didn't just send random envoys. They carefully selected bilingual scribes who understood the nuances of foreign courts, much like modern diplomats trained in cultural sensitivity. One remarkable letter from the king of Babylon insists his ambassador be given safe passage and respect as if he were my own person, an early glimmer of what we now call diplomatic immunity. Even the structure of modern treaties owes its existence to these ancient experiments. The famous peace agreement between Egypt and the Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh wasn't just a ceasefire. It was a meticulously detailed document with clauses on prisoner exchanges, mutual defense, and even extradition. Sound familiar? The same principles underpin everything from the Geneva Conventions to trade agreements today. What's astonishing isn't just their foresight, but how they anticipated pitfalls we still grapple with. When the treaty invoked 1,000 gods as witnesses, it wasn't mere superstition. It created multiple layers of accountability, ensuring neither side could easily back out without fearing divine retribution. A clever workaround for an era without international courts. Yet the most enduring legacy lies in the failures. The Bronze Age collapse taught humanity a brutal lesson. Diplomacy without enforcement is just poetry. Those kings learned too late that gifts and flattery couldn't substitute for genuine cooperation when famine or invasion struck. Fast forward to the founding of the United Nations, its entire security framework designed to avoid the same fatal weakness. The veto power of permanent Security Council members, a direct response to the Bronze Age's lesson that collective action fails when any major player can opt out. Perhaps the greatest testament to their influence is how we've inherited their blind spots too. Modern leaders still chase symbolic victories, signing climate accords with great fanfare while quietly missing emissions targets, just as Bronze Age rulers proclaimed eternal brotherhood while stockpiling weapons. The archives of Ugarit, filled with unanswered pleas for help, find eerie echoes in today's stalled responses to humanitarian crises. History didn't just preserve their innovations, it preserved their warnings, etched in cuneiform for anyone willing to read them. What makes these ancient diplomats truly timeless is their humanity. Behind the formal titles and flowery phrases, their letters reveal the same hopes and fears that drive international relations today. When the pharaoh wrote, "Let there be peace between us until the stars fall from heaven," he wasn't just crafting a pretty metaphor, he was reaching across the darkness, trying to build something more durable than stone. 3,000 years later, we're still reaching, still learning from their triumphs and catastrophes. The clay may have dried, but the conversation they started never really ended. The echoes of Bronze Age diplomacy reverberate through our modern world with uncanny precision, not because history repeats, but because human nature remains stubbornly consistent. Consider how today's trade disputes mirror the Amarna Letters' accusations of counterfeit gold. When nations impose tariffs or restrict critical exports, they're replaying a 3,000-year-old script where economic leverage doubles as political weaponry. The Hittites understood this when they embargoed Anatolian silver to pressure Assyria, just as modern energy wars prove resources still dictate alliances. The difference, our interconnected world, amplifies both the stakes and the speed of retaliation. Where Bronze Age kings waited months for messengers, today's sanctions trigger instant market tremors. Climate change adds another layer of resonance. The drought-stricken pleas of Hittite rulers for Egyptian grain read like early drafts of today's climate migration crises. Small island nations facing rising seas now issue the same desperate appeals that Bronze Age coastal cities once sent to inland powers, except our sea peoples aren't invaders, but hurricanes and crop failures. The bitter irony, we possess satellite data and climate models the ancients lacked, yet still emulate their fatal hesitation. When wealthy nations drag their feet on emissions cuts, they mirror Pharaoh Merneptah's half-empty grain ships, too little aid delivered too late. The most chilling parallel lies in the fragility of trust. Modern alliances like NATO or the Paris Agreement face the same existential test as Hittite-Egyptian treaties. Will members honor commitments when crisis strikes? The Bronze Age's answer was written in abandoned vassal states and burned archives. Today, we've simply swapped clay tablets for digital agreements, but the core challenge remains. Systems built on mutual interest crumble when self-preservation trumps collective survival. Russia's gas cuts to Europe in 2022 exposed this vulnerability with Bronze Age clarity, proving energy dependencies could become weapons as easily as ancient copper shipments. Yet there's hope in these shadows. Unlike Bronze Age rulers blinded by siloed information, we live in an age of unprecedented transparency if we choose to use it. Satellite imagery can verify treaty compliance, instant communication can clarify misunderstandings, and global scientific collaboration offers tools to address shared threats. The lesson isn't that we're doomed to repeat the past, but that we've inherited both their pitfalls and their ingenuity. When Cypriot merchants adapted to collapsed trade routes by becoming pirates, they demonstrated the same resilience as modern entrepreneurs pivoting during supply chain crises. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so urgently relevant isn't its inevitability, but its avoidable cascade of small failures. Each broken promise, each hoarded resource, each ignored warning seemed insignificant alone until the cumulative weight shattered civilizations. Today's diplomats hold an advantage those ancient scribes couldn't imagine: hindsight. The ruins of Hattusa and Ugarit aren't just archaeological sites, they're cautionary tales etched in clay, reminding us that the difference between survival and collapse often hinges on a simple choice: to see allies where others see rivals, and to act before the fire reaches our own gates. The collapse of Bronze Age diplomacy wasn't merely the fading of grand palaces or the silencing of royal scribes. It was the slow unraveling of a system built on words that ultimately lost their meaning. Those clay tablets, once heavy with promises, became relics of broken trust, their carefully inscribed vows reduced to hollow echoes. The Hittite king who begged Egypt for grain as his people starved, the Babylonian ruler who discovered his brother had sent gilded lead instead of gold, the vassal states that quietly switched allegiances when their overlords grew weak. All these threads, pulled one by one, left the tapestry of international order in tatters. But this story isn't just about ancient failures. It's a mirror held up to our own world, where diplomatic cables have replaced cuneiform, yet the same pitfalls lurk beneath polished rhetoric. Modern leaders still face the Hittite dilemma: honor alliances when it's costly, or prioritize survival and risk isolation. Climate accords strain as nations withhold action, just as Bronze Age kings hoarded grain while their neighbors burned. Trade wars flare over accusations of unfair practices, echoing the Amarna Letters' outrage over counterfeit shipments. Even the language of diplomacy carries faint whispers of antiquity. Today's strategic partnerships are little more than polished versions of brotherhood pledges, equally vulnerable to shifting interests. The lesson etched into these ruins isn't that diplomacy is futile, but that it demands more than performative gestures. Bronze Age kings mastered the art of flattery but forgot its purpose: to build genuine cooperation, not just fleeting advantage. When crisis came, their meticulously crafted alliances collapsed like sun-baked clay, because trust, once commodified, becomes brittle. The ruler of Ugarit learned this too late. His final plea for help found unsent in a kiln, his city's fate sealed by the silence of so-called allies. Yet within this tragedy lies a spark of hope. The Phoenicians, survivors of the collapse, emerged not by replicating failed systems but by reinventing them. Their lightweight alphabet, adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphs, became a tool of connection rather than control. Perhaps that's the ultimate takeaway: diplomacy must evolve or perish. Today's challenges, climate collapse, pandemics, cyber warfare, demand more than the Bronze Age's transactional mindset. They require something those ancient kings never quite achieved: the humility to recognize interdependence and the courage to act on it before the fires reach our gates. The last envoys of Hattusa likely never imagined their world could vanish. But their unanswered letters endure, not just as artifacts but as warnings. In the end, the collapse wasn't caused by invaders or drought alone, but by the slow erosion of the one thing holding civilizations together: the belief that promises matter. As we navigate our own age of uncertainty, their story urges us to ask: will we be remembered as architects of resilience, or as scribes drafting elegies for broken systems? The answer, like those ancient tablets, remains unknown.